All right, folks, we'll give just a minute for the stream to catch up with ourselves. I should start
Yeah.
hearing audio echoes in my feedback. This is the part of the stream we always trim off before we uh, release it for instant replay. Actually, we have two questions right to start with in the chat. Looks like people have posted chat questions recently. Fantastic. I love that. We will answer those. But hey, let's start there. Looks like that is working. And I bet if we're live on LinkedIn, we're also live on YouTube. Fantastic. All right. Good morning, everybody. This is the next in our OTEL webinars. Topic for this is getting started with OpenTelemetry, initial signals with OpenTelemetry. A big audience for these webinars has been the Signals community, and this may possibly be like a little more basic than that community needs. If you're already thinking about how you dashboard and how you store your data, maybe this isn't the thing that you need to learn. But anyway, with me is Pranay. Say hi to the people. Say like, what are you hoping the people take away today from this this starter guide?
Yeah, I think we thought to do this starter because we saw a lot of people, like most of the people in Signals community understand like what OpenTelemetry is, and they have been working with it. But we saw like we also conduct OpenTelemetry end user group for APAC. And that's where we see lots of people have like initial questions like, hey, how do I get started with OpenTelemetry? Is logs stable? How do I start sending my application tracing data? So like basic questions before any team starts to invest in OpenTelemetry, right? So we thought we'll do a mix of slightly basic topics so that people who are just exploring OpenTelemetry can get an overview and maybe can get a sense on like where the project is and get started with that. So yeah, I think that was the thought process behind this. And yeah, we'll get back on like more technical deep questions. And so we plan to alternate between like more technical deep questions versus like slightly beginner friendly, so that people who are just starting with OpenTelemetry can like also have something to work with.
And it's been an interesting thing for me to learn where there is and isn't great beginner information available for OpenTelemetry. I think that, of course, a lot of OpenTelemetry is like not maybe actually even intended as a beginner's tool, right? It's like, hey, you have a complex architecture, you need to do distributed tracing through it. And then here you are at the OpenTelemetry project. And since that's its inception, a lot of the material, frankly, starts by diving pretty deep. I grabbed some stuff from OpenTelemetry.io for this talk, but I'm like, oh boy, this is like pretty advanced when it's explained. And this is page one. This is page one of like getting started. And it's like, hey, let's talk about how you define the standard for transport. So speaking of more advanced topics, I just wanted to answer Pranav's question here in chat. It's like, hey, we talked about talking about Kafka with OTEL in a later webinar. When's that going to happen? That is going to happen next month, because we would do it in 2 weeks, but we're going away for our all staff, so we'll be meeting up in person. So may or may not get a chance to do that, but I will both announce it, and it will be in the topic, and I will message you directly when we're doing that, because we did want to do it this week, but it turned out to need just a little bit more research. And now I think I know most of how to do it. I may or may not go and actually do all the work to set up a local like Kafka queue to test it out. But yeah, that's a more advanced topic, and I would love to talk about it, where talking about sending OpenTelemetry data into a queue within your network. And then Nishant just mentions that, hey, the hours are not great for you, and we will be shifting those around a little bit. I do want to make it so that people from all over can join. I'm on the West Coast of the United States, so this is great for me. But I may start doing like we may start doing like an evening time slot for me, which would be
we will figure out. I think this webinar was primarily focused on our community in the US, and we'll see like what we can do for the US, India, or like the PAC region ecosystem.
And also,
let's get started.
If you're watching this as instant replay, we will answer your questions if you just comment them down below. So let's go ahead and dive in. So a pretty common question that we see, in a few formats, in a few places, especially people who are maybe just kind of dipping into the OpenTelemetry thing is like, what's the first thing that you should instrument with OpenTelemetry? Now, my presentation, I have an answer to this, but Pranay, I'm curious how you would answer this question of like, what's the first thing you'd instrument?
Yeah, so it depends upon like who is asking this question, right? So if it's an application developer, maybe the APM part is most interesting thing. Like if you're actually writing code and you want to understand that, hey, like is my code working well? Is it having high latency? So maybe you can get started with APM or like distributed tracing and just start seeing like what is the latency of your APIs. Is database taking more time? Are external calls taking more time? Things like that. But if you are somebody from the platform team or DevOps team, I think the first thing you may want to start with is like infrastructure metrics, right? That's like the P1 of like what you want to see. Are your machines running fine? Are the CPU memory registers are fine? Configure some alerts on top of that, and yeah. So it depends really on the persona which is trying to get started with OpenTelemetry. If you're a JavaScript developer, you just can uh, instrument your Node.js Express application and just get started with the latency, right? So
yeah, I really agree with that. I think also like you do see people who are like they're trying to evaluate like a full migration to OpenTelemetry. Is it better than whatever like closed source SaaS tool they're using now? And in that case, like, yeah, it may make sense to just dive really deep into like what kind of application performance metrics or APM you're getting and answer that early on, because if fundamentally you're like, hey, we can't do our jobs if this Java method is not automatically instrumented, it's a deal breaker for us, then that may well be where you start. I think I'm going to briefly step through this just because it's kind of a basic idea of like what is and isn't inside the OpenTelemetry project. Actually, we're going to come back to this slide. We're going to come back to this slide in a minute. I don't want to. We were in such a good flow here. Let me start with my recommendation, which is I recommend starting with infrastructure metrics if your desire is like, hey, I want to understand the OpenTelemetry project, because it's just the idea of like, hey, don't start with Kubernetes by trying to spin up 5 namespaces that talk to each other through, a synchronous data store, right? Like start with something that you can easily debug, that you can easily look at, and where the data collection is going to be working right off the bat. So I call this, it's free in terms of how much effort it is to get that data in, where when you think about like host metrics gathered by the OpenTelemetry collector, very well packaged and very easy to run anywhere, very easy for it to get these very basic host metrics out. And then even on the Kubernetes side, the OTel operator can grab you a bunch of inframetrics off of your cluster really easily. I also really like these because when you're thinking about metrics, and more on metrics to follow in some later talks, what you would be doing with these kinds of metrics is really, really obvious. And that seems like such a it's such a basic thing, but I really think it's worth discussing that, like, when we think about something like, hey, CPU, the all of the OpenTelemetry processor steps are really easy to understand, like why we do things a certain way. Hey, do you want to go ahead and average across? Do you want to report every X number of cycles? Do you want to average across that cycle, or do you want to report each time you have a report within there? Do you want to add up that value or not? So it's pretty easy to see, like, oh yeah, I don't want to add up the amount of RAM that I'm using, right? But you'll get to solve some basic questions. One thing that I think a lot of people run into when they're doing these basic information. Sorry, Pranay, you were saying something.
No, please continue. Nothing.
So one thing that I've seen is even trying to make those very basic dashboards make sense and be usable long term is its own question. So I've seen people say, hey, right now I'm reporting memory and I'm setting up alerts when memory usage goes over a certain point, but I'm worried because what if I upgrade my memory later? Right. So now I'm getting alerts, but we're only up to 50% of the usage, or in cluster land, right? We just start allocating more memory. And so this will encourage you to think about these basic steps all the way through, all the way from gathering the metric to sending it out. It is worth thinking about. So then we start thinking about, okay, where do we send this data? And this is where I want to talk about like what is and isn't inside the OpenTelemetry project. And this is from OpenTelemetry IO. And I want to step through this list and stop me if you've heard these ones, folks. But I actually think that even for some of us who are like using this a little bit, like just having a review of like this is what is and isn't inside the project is worth talking about. Pranay, did you have more on that, on the like gathering of metrics or stuff that people should think about day one or day two?
Yeah, I think one good tool. I think it's more of a generic advice is that if you're starting to play with any new project or new tool, what's the easiest way to get started is often the right way to get started. And then you just get started with the basic thing which this project does, which is like very easy to do. And if you get that done, basically you see some of your own data in a dashboard, you start getting more confidence, right? So I think what you said was very accurate, that you just get started with inframetrics. It's easy to do. Mostly people know what to do. And playing with it, you get to learn some part of the OpenTelemetry ecosystem. And you also have a success under your belt. So you can say that, okay, like I know how to configure inframetrics. Let's maybe go into application metrics. So yeah.
And you know, it's funny, part of me wants to open up your like collector diagrams from our previous webinar, because I do want to note that like one thing I have seen more than once, and I do encourage people to start with APM if that's what's on their mind, is you'll see people dive in, grab the SDK, realize, okay, so the SDK allows you to like feed in what endpoint you're sending each metric call to like directly. And so they're like dropping lines into their, you know, Java code or whatever, saying, okay, then go and send this across the wire to like, let me hard code in the URL of like where I want to pick up this OpenTelemetry data. And like that probably doesn't make a ton of sense. Like it would be much better to have a collector running within that pod, within that architecture that is then sending on data. You're not like sending out like a web request with every single time a metric like increments. And so you know, it's fine to have like blind alleys and like, hey, we pursued this for a little while and it excuse me, turned out not to be the right way to do this. But yeah, I think I that's the other reason I encourage thinking about host metrics or inframetrics first, is it will start you with being, okay, let me establish the collector here, make sure that it can send data to whatever kind of data backend we want to set up. And then, right, instrumenting your application code, you're just talking to this collector that you already set up. Right. And so that is a lot easier. So yeah, it kind of does make me want to break out all those diagrams, but I won't. I won't show every one of those. So we do have one in here in a couple slides, but so let's talk about what is and isn't OpenTelemetry. And it looks like we're coming through enough resolution. I realize this text is a little small, but here we go. This is what is in the project: a specification for all components, a standard protocol that defines the shape of telemetry data, and semantic conventions that define the standard naming scheme for common telemetry data types. So this is an example of like, is duration labeled in nanoseconds, right? Or is it in microseconds, and that kind of naming standard. And again, you know, is it nanoseconds duration nanoseconds, duration nano versus duration nanoseconds, those kinds of questions.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
APIs that define how to generate telemetry data. Actually, I do understand what that one means, but I'm like if you asked me if you said like say more about that, I would be like, where are the APIs? What's the point of these APIs? I think I get that one, but in general, like what calls you expect to be available to send data like to the collector. Mm-hmm. A library ecosystem that that implements instrumentation for common libraries and frameworks. So this is really critical, that part of the project, not just in some contributor kind of dusty backroom, is let's go ahead and automatically instrument a significant portion of mainline framework applications. So that's better and worse in different languages, or I won't even say better and worse. It is more and less automatic in different frameworks. And that's usually pretty like rational to how those frameworks work, right? Like Java is notoriously very easy to automatically instrument because you can do all this, you know, build time and bytecode manipulation to do this kind of stuff. And then others are more difficult. Okay. automatic instrumentation components that generate telemetry data without requiring code changes. So yeah, I kind of smudged these two points together, right? What is a set of libraries to say, hey, you can just make a call right from your Ruby code or right from your Java code to say, I want to send this metric, I want to log this line, I want to add this span to a trace, but then also automatic instrumentation. And then language SDKs that implement the specification, APIs, and the export of telemetry data. So these are this kind of troika there. And then the OpenTelemetry collector, a proxy that receives, processes, and exports telemetry data. So a question I used to get all the time is like, can we do this without the collector? And the answer is like, technically yes, but you're hurting me by doing this. You're causing me harm. And that's kind of what I was referring to as generally a process with no collector or with a collector, like just the Signa's collector or just somebody else's, just Telemetry Hub's collector or just the Honeycomb collector, but you're like sending data straight out for your code. That nobody's going to tell you to do that. So okay for your test on your dev environment, and then various other tools such as the OpenTelemetry operator for Kubernetes. So yeah, that's the list of like, that's what is and isn't inside the project. I think it's interesting that auto instrumentation is inside the project, but data backends, as we're going to talk about, are not inside the project.
Yeah, I think one of the core parts is basically defining the specs and the APIs. So that's like an independent part of what the project defines. And then it also provides a SDK which sort of implements it, right? So that you can get started very quickly, and they have by default auto instrumentation components, so that like you don't really have to worry too much about like, are you instrumenting the right libraries, are you instrumenting the right frameworks. It will put that auto instrumentation SDK, and then it will automatically detect the libraries for which there's an OpenTelemetry instrumentation available, and then like install those libraries, right? So that's, I think, pretty powerful. One thing I think so primarily if you look into it, right, it's like two parts. One is specs and APIs to send data, and the second part is the OpenTelemetry collector. So broadly speaking, these are the two big pieces. And in the specs and APIs to send data, there are like multiple languages and frameworks, 6, which implement for like each individual languages, right? So that's how broadly how I see what's in the scope for OpenTelemetry project.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you're having trouble like sending data from your language, that is something that should be handled like within the project. And in general, all the way out to Rust in terms of obscurity, not the Rust obscure. Rust is great. We love you so much, Rust. But, this is covered. Like the sending of data, hey, I want to go in and edit my code and send application data is covered. I will be curious. I actually don't know about auto instrumentation in Rust projects, but, certainly that like level of, hey, I can make calls right from my code where I'm not having to go and like negotiate an HTTP connection to send my metrics data should all be handled. Okay, so this gets me to this slide about like, then you need to send your data somewhere. So that's, I think, the thing that stands out as being outside of the project and is actually like on that page is like the next thing is like, hey, how the data is stored particularly, and then how it's presented to you are not part of the project. So, a counterexample is like Jaeger, which covers things end to end, right? So it's like, oh, you can run a Jaeger server, which will store data, which will present those traces to you. But again, that's very like tracing specific. It's not necessarily for all types of data, but yeah, that's a different project spec. So here we go with that just conceptualization. This is from last week's webinar to think about what is part of the OpenTelemetry collector, right? Where you say, hey, it's doing these 3 steps to your data, but they're still going to need some kind of storage background and also some kind of query and visualization thing. I'm going to break the rules of presentation and not read every word of this page, but because we said all of these words already. But the big one is these 3 steps. Let's talk about that for sure. Is the receivers, which is ability to pick up data, put it into the OpenTelemetry collector. And there's a big project around that. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Processors being a few things at a basic level, right? Like compression and batching of data, but also things like, hey, I want to pull out personally identifying data. I want to maybe normalize. I have two services. They're implemented a little differently. I want to normalize that data a little bit. Things like parsing, right? You have like maybe unstructured logs. You want to do some parsing of that data before you send it on. And then finally, exporters, like where's it going to go? Which can be very simple, which can be just, hey, that's just going to go right into, another OpenTelemetry collector or a sort of OpenTelemetry ecosystem. But obviously the closed source boys are still out there, right? The SaaS people are still out there. And so they have their own exporters. So you absolutely can say, hey, I have a great experience with collecting this data, but I love this existing SaaS tool so much. And they will certainly accept that data from you. And there's pretty broad acceptance of that. I would say, like, what's an export you can't do? My understanding is that you can't like move your distributed trace into AWS X-Ray, for example, into some of the like cloud specific monitoring tools. That limitation probably would make some sense. Don't quote me on that. I'll get an answer to that and add to the comments. But yeah, obviously for any like large like observability platform, those exporters exist. Yeah. Pranay, you were looking like you were thinking, like, can you do this? Feel free to answer if you know the answer. But
well, actually, I'm also not sure on like can you do that. But I think the key point here is that there are some things which are not part of the OpenTelemetry project. So, for example, the visualization layer, alerts, setting dashboards, setting retention policies, and for that, basically, you use backend like Signos or any other SaaS vendors or tools like Grafana, etc. Right? So, I think that's some of the times I see people getting confused that, hey, like if I use OpenTelemetry, do I also share dashboards? So that's not really in the scope of the project.
Yeah. And so we don't cover it much in this talk, but like while it's very straightforward to use a tool like Signos or Prometheus or Grafana to do like a basic dashboard to say, hey, I'm going to track this CPU metric. That's why it's a good place to start. I think we can all understand that then you get to more advanced cases and you're going to want to evaluate a tool or two, right? To look at like, does it give me the data that I need to like, what are we really using from our observability tools now and where do we want that to go? Yeah. And then, so once you're collecting these like host and infrastructure metrics, a good second step is thinking about logging. And again, this is, you can have your own path through here, but just it's worth considering thinking about how we're handling logging. It should be pretty doable as a project. And you can also use some of that collector power to do some of your logs parsing that might improve your experience a little bit. Now, I want to make one note here. This is my first big mistake when I started writing about OpenTelemetry about 3.5 years ago. Well, maybe time's fake. I'm not sure the exact time that was, but I said like, hey, you might not want to use, I can't remember which one I said. I think it was Ruby. I was like, well, you might not want to do this because logs are not yet implemented. Right. And I think I saw just as this is like the current version of this status chart that's like, oh, and metrics aren't implemented. It's like Ruby's really not ready for like prime time. And the metric situation is a little complicated on Ruby, and I'm not going to speak to that, but like the logs is what we're talking about here, because this sort of makes it look like, right, if you have Ruby or you're on Rust or what have you, that like, you have no support for sending in your logs to this OpenTelemetry endpoint. But that's probably not the case, right? So the issue here is we'd like to have full SDK support within each of these frameworks to be able to say, okay, from the start, I'm going to do OpenTelemetry logging. So I'm going to install the Ruby OTel SDK and make a call to that SDK every time I want to log, which would be rad. And I agree. We'd like to see that implemented. But you are already sending your logs somewhere. I hope. I hope your logs are not just getting dumped into console and killing your instance, right? So given that you've already done that work, again, there's that thing with the collector, right? That it has its own ways to import data, right? Or it has multiple projects to import data. And so take a look. I apologize, this is like low res, but I'll drop the link in chat in a sec here. But it's if you look at the wait, wrong slide. There we go.
Sorry.
If you look at the contrib repo for the OpenTelemetry collector, you can look through these receivers. There are tons for whatever logging that you may wish. And in fact, I think I'd like grab some screenshots at first, but yes. So the point is that if you are sending logs currently by some method, right? So there's like the free level of Splunk that sends logs, right? And there's absolutely a way to like grab those logs, and it's totally supported by Splunk, right? Like they're like, hey, you can send these logs anywhere. Of course, you can send them into the OpenTelemetry collector.
Yeah, so I think the two sort of modes of sending logs which is always available. One is the writing something in file and then reading from those files. So there's a file log receiver in OpenTelemetry, which you can always use. And then OpenTelemetry also supports these log collectors. For example, I think they support Fluent D, Fluent Bit, and Logstash. So if you already have a pipeline set up with any of these three log collectors, you can configure OpenTelemetry collector to get logs from there, right? So you don't have to do any work. You just can start configuring like whatever is configured in your log collector. So you can just start sending that data to OpenTelemetry collector. So what Nica was pointing out, like what OpenTelemetry official site lists as logs being not implemented, is the SDK. Like, is there a Ruby SDK to send logs directly? But as you know, like there are other ways to send logs.
Yeah, absolutely. And so yeah, I think that's pretty critical, is to just be aware that there's more options here than just using the SDK. And yeah, it's very likely that you already have some kind of logs export. If you don't, if you're, hey, I'm doing this from scratch, I'm doing this as a student, or hey, we just really have not, our observability thing was kind of a tech debt point here. You absolutely can do it, right? Because again, you can be writing to a file and reading from that, batching it with the collector and sending it out. But yeah, you probably are sending logs somewhere already, and you should be able to leverage that. So talking a little bit about where we're going with logging. So this is if you're watching this on instant replay and you're like, hey, I want to lie down now. This was a lot. I'm gonna go try this tomorrow. Feel free to hit mute for 5 minutes while we talk about this. But just conceptually, the goal of where OpenTelemetry is trying to get to in this question of like what is supported and what's not, right, is talking about.
Hey, so there's a question. I'm not sure if you want to take
can we say that it's another SIEM tool alternative to Splunk? I do not know the definition of SIEM, so now I want to know that.
Yeah, so I can take this up. So
security information and event management. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I don't think OpenTelemetry is primarily focused on security. So Splunk also, for example, has already product, but they also have a security product, right? But OpenTelemetry primarily focuses on observability, which is like if you are running your production systems, how do you ensure that they are running fine? And if there are any issues, how can you debug them faster? So that's primarily the scope of the domain of OpenTelemetry. And that's where the project is focused on. Though the data which OpenTelemetry SDK sent, for example, the tracing data which application sends, essentially that's the same type of data which can be used to do more advanced security analysis. If you're sending a trace data and in the trace data you see certain type of payload coming, and then you can analyze that payload and understand that, hey, is this a security vulnerability or not, right? So all the data is essentially there, but as of now, I don't think the project is focused on security use case, and I think even the vendors are more observability focused vendors which support that. So yeah, I don't think today you can use OpenTelemetry more for security use cases.
Yeah, I would say definitely, like in terms of just like using the OpenTelemetry project to do a ton of security may not make it's not gonna you're not going to have some of the things you would expect with like even a basic security tool. I just wanted to point out this talk from Ron Vider at Oxeye, who is using OpenTelemetry to do security monitoring. That's more leveraging one of the kind of basic components of OpenTelemetry to do some pretty specific work, which there are some other examples out there. The guys at Signodot is they're doing very cool stuff with the context propagation that comes as part of OpenTelemetry. A lot of those tools also work with other context propagation tools like Jaeger. So those are very interesting. Those are probably not like core mainline use cases. And if you go and join the CNCF Slack or the Signos Slack or other communities where we're talking about OpenTelemetry, security is not going to be like the first thing that we talk about for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is out there. So back to this, not to drag the conversation back, but that's a great question. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, existing logging solutions are currently weakly integrated with the rest of observability signals. Logs typically have limited support in tracing and monitoring tools in the form of links that use available and often incomplete correlation information. This correlation may be fragile because the attributes are often added to logs, traces, and metrics via different means, e.g. using different collector agents. So this is talking about the current state of logging and observing that there are some pretty basic, and this we do not need to get every step of this chart, but the idea is that it would be nice if there was a more cohesive solution to tagging all of the parameters on logs, to do logs that are not just structured, but that are implicitly connected to both the time spans of tracing and the metrics that we're gathering. So consistent naming, consistent structure of, for example, event data, that would be cool. And so this is a little bit of vision for the future, and also like why it may make sense, even if you're doing a little bit of work right now for logging that feels almost like repetition of what you've done before, connecting a logging tool, it may make sense to be thinking about OpenTelemetry for the future.
Yeah, and like one thing I want to point out here, which might be relevant, is that there is a way today where you can add tracing data, logs data to traces, right? So the other way is not maybe as simple, but like you can add logs data to traces. So actually we have recently shipped a feature in Signals where you can go to a trace page and then see related logs to that. Because if you pass that logs context to traces, you can actually figure out that, hey, this is during the request propagation of this trace, these were the logs which were emitted. And you can see just by say clicking a particular link, right? So we have checked this out, feature in Signals. I think you'll like it. So I think where the project is broadly going is in terms of, because it has defined this uniform resource layer, and it has a concept of baggage which sort of does context propagation across signals like metrics, traces, and logs. I think where the project is going is to be able to correlate much deeply across metrics, traces, and logs. And one of the ways through which this can be done is through the resources thing, which maybe, Nica, this is a good topic which you can talk about, like how does the resources work in OpenTelemetry. And yeah, I think any OpenTelemetry native tools like Signals will be leveraging those features to like make this much easier, like the correlation across signals much easier.
Yeah. And I think this is like the basic challenge. I think when someone says, oh, well, we gather or we show you OpenTelemetry data, is like really thinking about how you connect all of those points, because there really should be this really nice, as they say here, right at this core, is like correlated telemetry, right? Coming through in this really clean signal. And that kind of connection is tricky. And so, of course, I want to be vendor neutral on this talk. It's not that we have at Signals like a monopoly on a good way to do this, but I also think it's worth being aware that some very big, very expensive SaaS tools that are not OpenTelemetry. So see, I can be that level of vendor not neutral that I want to support the OpenTelemetry project. Is they struggle with this still. This is not a done deal. Someone can say to you single pane of glass and charge you $10,000 a month for SaaS tools and still be like, well, if your logs are connected, they'll show up here for your trace, right? Well, will they be connected every time? Oh no. Sometimes the logs will get connected correctly, not every time. And so I think that's just worth being aware of. And so thinking about distributed tracing and context propagation across that stack. Of course, we got there to talking about a little bit, but that's definitely something to be talking about coming soon in future webinars. All right, folks, that's most of what I wanted to talk about. Pranay, did you have other stuff that you wanted to say or make sure that people understood? We said when we rehearsed this, it might be just like 10, 15 minutes to talk about this, and then we ended up talking for half an hour, but that happens.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that in each webinar, we are getting some new topics which we can talk about in the next topic. Yeah. So for example, last webinar, we thought like, hey, it would be great to talk about Kafka. Maybe this webinar, we are getting indication that maybe resources and context propagation and correlation might be a great place to sort of get started. But I think
it might really be interesting to talk about like what context propagation unlocks for you. But I think, the starter of saying, hey, it unlocks this ability to like really connect your logs across the stack and really know, hey, when I did this trace, which happened at a particular place in time, really getting it accurate to what's connecting it to something else. And so what they mentioned there in the write-up is really true. And so worth talking about for a future one. But that's kind of the way. There's a lot to talk about with OpenTelemetry, and it's new territory for a lot of people, so we love that. Okay, folks, you do go ahead and hit follow if you want to see more of this. If you're watching this on instant replay, which, by the way, thank you so much for checking out the last episode. There were many of you who went and did that. Do feel free to drop a question in the comments down below. We will definitely get back to and answer all those. And thank you so much for joining us, folks.
Yeah, thanks for joining. Bye-bye.